The grit of the cold hearthstone bit into Seraphina's knees, a sharp reminder that the world she once knew had ended at the altar. She did not rise. Instead, she leaned into the labor, the hem of her cream-colored wedding silk, a gown that cost more than a village's winter harvest, soaking up the grey slurry of ash and stagnant water. With every rhythmic stroke of the burlap cloth, the fine lace at her wrists frayed, catching on the jagged stone. She was no longer a bride, she was a woman scrubbing a grave. On her right hand, the gravesend's signet ring felt like a leaden weight. It was a monstrous thing of black iron, scented with a ruby that looked like a congealed drop of ancient blood. It was far too large for her slender finger, anchored only by a strip of torn lace she had used to bind it in place. Every time she moved, the iron clinked against the stone, a cold, metallic pulse that echoed through the hollow silence of the conservatory. It was a promise. Julian had sold her for gold, but the Duke had inadvertently given her the keys to a kingdom of shadows. The air in the room was thick with the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of the Duke's rot. Behind her, the shadows seemed to lengthen, detaching themselves from the cracked glass walls. A heavy, dragging footfall broke the silence, followed by a rasping breath that sounded like wind through dry leaves. "You are ruining your finery, Duchess," a voice grated. It was Lucian. He stood in the arched doorway, his face a landscape of peeling parchment and sunken hollows, half hidden by the fur-lined darkness of his robes. He watched her with a mixture of predatory curiosity and profound confusion. In his world, women fainted or fled. They did not kneel in the dirt to claim it. Seraphina did not flinch. She wrung out the cloth, her knuckles white, and finally looked up. The moonlight caught the iron ring, making the ruby glow with a sudden, fierce light. "The finery was a shroud, Your Grace," she said, her voice cutting through the gloom like a blade. "Julian meant for me to die in it. I find I would rather live in the soot." She stood slowly, ignoring the ache in her joints and the ruined state of her silk. She held up her hand, let the heavy iron ring catch the Duke's gaze, and felt the power shift. The rotting Duke was a man entombed by neglect, surrounded by servants who plundered his wealth while he withered in the dark. "The hearth is clean," she whispered, stepping toward him until she could smell the ancient dust of his coat. "Tomorrow, I begin on the rest of your house, and then I shall begin on mine." The chapel at the edge of the Gravesend estate smelled of cold ash and the slow, inevitable crawl of damp. It was a place where prayers had long since died, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic clink of metal hitting wood. Seraphina stood perfectly still, the silk of her wedding gown a ghostly white against the blackened stone walls. Her eyes were fixed on Julian. He wasn't looking at her. He was leaning over a scarred oak table, his fingers dancing with a feverish, frantic energy as they moved through a pile of heavy gold sovereigns. The light from a single, guttering candle cast long, distorted shadows across his face, revealing a greedy, desperate smile that Seraphina had never seen during their 3-year courtship. 1,200, 1,300, Julian murmured, his voice thick with a hunger that turned her stomach. "Julian," her voice was a fragile thread in the cavernous dark. "The carriage is waiting. Why are we here? Why is the Duke's man holding my trunks?" Julian didn't look up. He slid a stack of coins into a burlap bag, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "The carriage is waiting for me, Seraphina, not for you." He finally turned, and the condescending pity in his eyes was more violent than a blow. "I've had a run of wretched luck at the tables. Gravesend was holding my markers. It was either my life or your hand. And let's be honest, my love, you always did enjoy being the center of a grand house." The realization hit her with the force of a physical weight, cold and suffocating. She wasn't a bride. She was a payment, a piece of collateral handed over to settle a ledger of wine and bad bets. "You sold me," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Like a horse, like a plot of timber." "I traded you," Julian corrected smoothly, stepping closer. He reached out to pat her cheek, his hands smelling of the copper coins he had just been fondling. "Think of it as a promotion, from a mere Mrs. Whitmore to a Duchess. Most women would thank me for the elevation." From the deepest shadows of the altar, a figure shifted. Seraphina had thought it a statue, but as it moved into the candlelight, the horror of her elevation became clear. Duke Lucian Gravesend did not walk so much as he glided. his fur-lined robes dragging over the stone like a funeral shroud. His face was a nightmare of parchment-thin skin, peeling away to reveal the hollowed, grey contours of a man who was already half decayed. The rotting Duke was not a myth whispered by the servants. He was a living, breathing testament to a life consumed by shadow. The Duke reached out a hand, his fingers spindly, the skin stretched tight over bone, and pointed to the bag of gold. "Is the sum sufficient, Whitmore?" "Exceedingly, Your Grace," Julian chirped, his casual tone a jagged contrast to the Duke's gravelly rasp. He grabbed the bag, the gold clinking with a sickening final sound. "She's all yours, a bit spirited, but I'm sure you'll find a way to quiet her down." Julian didn't offer a final embrace. He didn't even look back as he hurried toward the heavy oak doors, his boots clicking rhythmically against the stone. The doors groaned on their rusted hinges and slammed shut, the echo ringing through the chapel like the closing of a tomb. Seraphina was left in the dark with the smell of the grave and the man who had bought her. She looked at the Duke, her breath hitching in her throat, and saw him watching her. He didn't move toward her. He simply stood there, a ruin of a man in a ruin of a chapel, his sunken eyes reflecting the dying flicker of the candle. The silence was absolute. The trade was complete. Seraphina Veilcrest was no longer a woman with a future. She was the property of a monster. The carriage ride to Gravesend Hall was a journey through a landscape of skeletal trees and mist that clung to the carriage windows like a shroud. Inside the grand, suffocating foyer of the estate, the air felt ancient, heavy with the scent of cedar oil and something sharper, the copper tang of stagnant blood and the dry musk of a tomb. Duke Lucian moved ahead of her, his silhouette jagged and swaying under the flickering light of a single candelabra held by a silent, hunched steward. He led her to a drawing room where the furniture was draped in dust sheets, looking like a gathering of ghosts. The Duke turned to face her, the light carving deep, harrowing valleys into his peeling skin. He stood in the center of the room, waiting. His chest heaved with a shallow, rattling breath, and his sunken eyes remained fixed on her face, searching for the inevitable. He expected the scream. He had seen it a dozen times before, the way women's throats constricted, the way they stumbled back in a blind panic to escape the sight of his rot. He braced himself for the high-pitched terror that usually punctuated his first nights, with the collateral scent to satisfy debts. Seraphina stood her ground. Her wedding silk was torn, her skin was pale, and her heart felt like a drum in a hollow chest, but she did not look away. She studied the way the curse climbed his neck, the way his fingers twitched with a tremors he couldn't mask. The silence stretched between them, thin and brittle. "Well," Lucian's voice was a jagged rasp, a sound that seemed to physically hurt his throat. "Will you not weep? Will you not beg for a priest to exorcise the monster Julian has chained you to?" Seraphina took a step forward, her chin tilting upward. The fear was there, a cold coil in her stomach, but beneath it was a mounting, white-hot fury directed at the man who had sold her, and an icy, practical resolve. "Julian did not chain me to a monster, Your Grace," she said, her voice surprisingly steady in the cavernous room. "He chained me to a business arrangement, and if I am to be the Duchess of Gravesend, I refuse to be a silent partner in a failing firm." Lucian blinked, a slow, rattling movement of his heavy eyelids. "What?" "The servants are ghosts, the silver is tarnished, and the gardens are a graveyard," Seraphina continued, her eyes sweeping the room with clinical precision. "You bought me to settle a debt, which means you value assets. I am now your primary asset." She walked past him, her ruined skirts whispering against the floorboards, and stopped before a massive, dust-caked mahogany desk. She traced a finger through the grime, leaving a sharp, clean line. "I will not scream, and I will not beg," she said, turning to face the bewildered Duke. "But I will have order. Before you retire to your chambers, Your Grace, I require the estate ledgers. I want to see the accounts, the tenant rolls, and the list of creditors." Lucian stared at her, his skeletal jaw dropping slightly. He had expected a victim. He had found an auditor. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of his isolation was pierced by a flicker of something that wasn't despair. It was curiosity. "The ledgers are in the library," he croaked, gesturing vaguely toward the dark hallway, but they have not been balanced in a decade. Then it is fortunate you traded for me, Seraphina replied, her voice as cold and hard as the iron ring on her finger. Because by dawn, I shall know exactly what we owe and exactly who owes us. The morning sun struggled to pierce the grime-caked windows of the servants' hall, casting sickly yellow squares onto a floor that hadn't seen a brush in years. Seraphina stood at the head of the long, scarred table, her wedding silk now hidden beneath a heavy, borrowed woolen shawl. She looked less like a bride and more like a commander surveying a battlefield of filth. In her hand, she held the ledgers. They were a map of betrayal. For a decade, while Duke Lucian had retreated into the darkness of his own decay, the staff had treated Gravesend Hall like a carcass to be picked clean. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice dropping like a stone into the uneasy silence. The butler, a man whose round belly and polished boots suggested a prosperity the rest of the house lacked, stepped forward. He wore a mask of practiced, condescending servitude. "Your Grace, surely the ledgers are a dry task for a lady of your delicate transition." "Delicate?" Seraphina's gaze snapped to his. She slapped the ledger open on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "According to these books, we have paid for 5,000 pounds of coal this winter, yet the Duke shivers in a library where the frost grows on the inside of the glass. We have paid for prime cuts of beef, while the larder contains nothing but salted pork and mould." A murmur of nervous shifting broke out among the gathered footmen and maids. Holloway's face paled, then flushed a deep, indignant purple. "The accounts are complex, madam. The Duke." The Duke was distracted. Seraphina cut him off, her voice rising with a cold, ringing authority. "I am not. I spent my night tracing the complexity of your theft. The coal was sold to the village smith. The beef went to the local inn. You didn't just steal from a master, Holloway. You scavenged from a man who was suffering. You treated this house like a grave, assuming the inhabitant was too dead to notice his pockets being emptied." She reached into the pocket of her gown and pulled out the heavy iron signet ring, placing it on the table. The ruby glared like an accusing eye. "You, the cook, and the head groom are dismissed without references," she stated. "You have 1 hour to pack your personal belongings. If I find so much as a silver spoon in your trunks, I shall not call the constables. I shall ask the Duke to personally oversee your departure in the cellar. I believe you've heard the stories of what happens to those who truly anger him." The mention of Lucian's rot sent a visible shudder through the staff. The superstition they had used as a shield to hide their crimes was now being turned against them as a weapon. "You can't do this," Holloway hissed, his composure finally shattering. "You're nothing but a trade, a gambling debt." Seraphina stepped closer, her face inches from his. The smell of the hearth soot still clung to her, a scent of industry and fire. "I am the Duchess of Gravesend, and I have found that while the Duke may be rotting on the outside, this house is rotting from within. I am the cure." As the disgraced servants slunk away, Seraphina turned to the remaining maids, girls with hollow cheeks and frightened eyes. She did not offer them a smile. She offered them a bucket and a brush. "We start with the windows," she said, her fingers curling around the iron ring. "I want the light to reach every corner of this tomb. We are going to see exactly what we have left to fight with." The library was a cavern of leather and shadows, the air so cold it felt brittle. Seraphina sat by the small, resurrected fire, not with a book of poetry, but with a stack of personal correspondence she had unearthed from the Duke's private bureau. Lucian sat across from her, his face half lost to the gloom, his skeletal hands clutching the arms of his chair as if he were braced for an impact. "Why do you persist?" he asked, his voice a jagged whisper. "The windows are clear, the thieves are gone, yet you remain in this charnel house. You have seen the skin slough from my bones, Seraphina. You know the rot is not merely in the walls." Seraphina paused, a yellowed letter in her hand. It was an old missive from his former betrothed, dated a decade ago, a cruel, mocking rejection that coincided with the first signs of his malady. She looked from the ink-stained parchment to the man before her. She didn't see a monster, she saw a reflection. "I grew up believing that blood and vows were the strongest anchors in this world," she said softly, rising to stand before him. I believed Julian loved me. I believed my family would protect me. But when the gold was placed on the table, they dissolved like salt in the rain. She knelt before him, not out of submission, but to look into the hollows of his eyes. This rot, Lucian, it didn't start with a germ or a fever. It started the day they turned their backs on you, didn't it? It is the physical weight of being discarded. The Duke flinched, his rattling breath hitching. The ruby on Seraphina's finger glowed in the firelight, casting a red hue over his grey, peeling skin. It is a curse of the soul, she continued, her voice gaining a fierce, resonant warmth. It is the body agreeing with the world's cruelty, mimicking the decay of a heart that has been told it is worthless. I felt it too. In the chapel, when the doors slammed shut, I felt my own skin turn to ash. I felt the grave opening for me. She reached out, and for the first time she did not hesitate. She placed her hand, the one bearing his iron ring, directly over his skeletal fingers. The contact was shocking. His skin was as cold as marble, yet beneath it, she felt the faint, frantic thrum of a pulse. "We are the same, Your Grace," she whispered. "We were both traded, both betrayed, both left to rot in the dark. But a curse built on a lie cannot survive a truth." Lucian did not pull away. A single, jagged tremor shook his frame, and for a fleeting second, the grey pallor of his hand seemed to flush with the faintest ghost of warmth. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the reflection of her iron-willed resolve stared back at him from the abyss. He was no longer alone in the tomb. The vault beneath the master study did not smell of decay, but of something far more potent, survival. It was a small, iron-bound room filled with the scent of old parchment and the cold, metallic tang of uncirculated coin. While the rest of the house had suffered under the pilfering hands of the servants, this room, the Duke's private treasury, had remained untouched, sealed by a lock that required the heavy iron signet now resting on Seraphina's finger. Lucian stood in the doorway, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the floor. He watched in silence as Seraphina moved with the precision of a jeweler, sorting through promissory notes and bags of high-yield bonds. She was no longer the girl in the torn wedding silk. She was an architect of ruin. "You have enough wealth here to buy a kingdom, Lucian," she said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Yet you allowed Julian Whitmore to believe you were a desperate man who would pay any price for a bride." "I was a man who had forgotten the value of gold, for I had nothing left to buy," the Duke replied, his rasp slightly smoother, less like a death rattle. Seraphina looked up, a sharp, cold light in her eyes. "Then let me show you what it can purchase. It can purchase silence. It can purchase loyalty. And most importantly, it can purchase the ground right out from under a traitor's feet." She pulled a series of ledger entries from her pocket, names and sums she had squeezed from the local solicitor the day before. Julian Whitmore was not a man of subtle vices. Since the night of the trade, he had been a fixture at the high-stakes tables of London, fueled by the gold he had gained from selling his soul. He was a man drowning in a sea of debt, buoyed only by the assumption that he was still a man of means. "Julian's gambling markers are being sold for pennies on the pound in the city," Seraphina explained, her fingers tracing the seal of a prominent London bank. "The creditors are nervous. They think he is a spent force." She took a quill and dipped it into the ink, her movements fluid and decisive. "I am using your agents to buy every single one of them. The debts from his tailor, the mortgages on his family's primary estate in Kent, the markers from his club. I want every scrap of paper that bears his signature." Lucian stepped into the light of the vault, his sunken eyes fixed on her. "You are making yourself his master." "No," Seraphina corrected, signing the final authorization with a flourish that caught the fire of the ruby on her hand. "I am making myself his landlord. He thinks he is free because he has gold in his pockets. He doesn't realize that the very roof over his head, the bed he sleeps in, and the coat on his back now belong to the Duchess of Gravesend." She looked at the Duke, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips, a smile that was beautiful and terrifying all at once. "He traded me for a bag of gold. I am trading that gold for his entire world. And the best part, Lucian, is that he will not know the blow has been struck until I am standing in his parlor to collect the interest." For the first time, the Duke didn't look at his own hands with disgust. He looked at Seraphina with a profound, terrifying respect. The first glimmer of true power had returned to Gravesend Hall, and it was colder and brighter than any sun. The winter frost had begun to recede from the windowpanes of Gravesend Hall, but inside, the atmosphere remained as sharp and lethal as a drawn blade. Seraphina sat at the mahogany desk she had reclaimed from the dust, a stack of heavy, cream-colored cardstock laid out before her. In her left hand, she held the Duke's iron signet, in her right, a sealing wax of the deepest, most arrogant gold. Lucian stood by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames casting a healthier glow upon his features. The rot had not vanished, but it had stilled. The jagged edges of his skin no longer seemed to weep, and his posture had regained a haunting, regal stature. He watched as Seraphina dipped her quill into an inkwell of midnight blue, her hand moving with the ruthless grace of a judge signing a warrant. "You are inviting the wolf back into the fold," Lucian observed, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "I'm inviting a beggar to see what he threw away," Seraphina corrected without looking up. She pressed the iron signet into the molten gold wax, the Gravesend crest snapping into place with a definitive, crunching sound. "Julian loves a spectacle. He loves the scent of old money and the promise of a high-status table. If the invitation is grand enough, his ego will not allow him to refuse." The card was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It was embossed with gold leaf and written in a script that spoke of ancient, untouchable power. It did not ask for his presence, it commanded it. It announced a grand masque at Gravesend Hall to celebrate the elevation of the Duchess. "He believes you are a ghost, Seraphina," the Duke said, stepping closer to the desk. "He believes this house is a tomb and that I am the corpse who keeps you here. To receive this, it will feel like a summons from the afterlife." "Let him wonder," she replied, her eyes flashing with a cold, predatory brilliance. "He spent his blood money in the gutters of London, thinking he had won. I want him to arrive at our gates dressed in his finest finery, fueled by the hope that he can wiggle back into my good graces now that I am a Duchess of means." She stood, the heavy silk of her new gown, a deep, bruised violet, hissing against the floorboards. She handed the envelope to the new footman she had hired, a young man who looked at her with a loyalty that had been bought with fair wages and the Duke's renewed authority. "See that this is hand-delivered to Mr. Whitmore's club in St. James," she commanded. "Ensure he is surrounded by his peers when he opens it. I want the world to see the moment the tether pulls tight." As the footman departed, Seraphina turned to Lucian. She reached out and adjusted the fur on his collar, her fingers lingering near the pulse point of his neck. The Duke did not flinch. He leaned into her touch, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had forged in the soot. "The trap is set," she whispered, the ruby on her finger catching the light like a drop of fresh blood. "He thinks he is coming to a feast. He doesn't realize he is the main course." The invitation was more than a social gesture. It was the first note of a funeral dirge. Seraphina Veilcrest had been traded in the dark, but she would take her revenge in the blinding light of 1,000 candles. The night of the masque transformed the shadowed halls of Gravesend into a cathedral of light. 1,000 candles flickered in the crystal chandeliers, their glow reflected in the freshly polished marble and the nervous eyes of the local gentry. The ton had arrived in a flutter of silk and hushed whispers, drawn by a morbid curiosity they could not suppress. They expected a wake. They expected to see the tragic Seraphina Veilcrest withered and broken by the side of a monster. When the great doors of the ballroom swung open, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Seraphina appeared at the head of the staircase, a vision of lethal elegance in a gown of midnight velvet that shimmered like a bruised sky. But it was the man at her side who froze the breath in every throat. Duke Lucian Gravesend did not hide in the shadows of a fur-lined cowl tonight. He stood tall, his shoulders broad, and set with a military precision that had long been forgotten. He was not cured of his history, but he was transformed. The rot that had once seemed like a weeping wound had settled into something else, a map of silvered scars and toughened skin that looked more like hammered metal than decaying flesh. His eyes, once sunken pits of despair, burned with a cold, predatory intelligence. He looked like an ancient king who had crawled out of the earth to reclaim a stolen crown. A collective shiver rippled through the crowd. This was not the creature of their ghost stories. This was a man of terrifying presence. The beauty of the Duchess and the rugged, iron-willed survival of the Duke created a contrast so sharp it felt like a physical blow. "He lives," Lady Ashby whispered, her fans snapping shut with a sound like a bone breaking. "And God help us, he looks as though he could crush us all with a single word." As the couple descended the stairs, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Seraphina's hand rested lightly on Lucian's arm, her iron signet ring catching the light with every step. She felt the rhythmic strength in his stride, a stark contrast to the rattling ghost he had been only months before. She had not merely scrubbed his flaws, she had rebuilt the man from the marrow out. "They are terrified, Lucian," she murmured, her voice a low, melodic chime that carried only to his ear. "They are reminded of who holds the keys to their world," the Duke responded, his voice no longer a death rattle, but a deep, resonant bass that vibrated through her fingertips. "You have given me back my voice, Seraphina. I find I have much to say to those who hoped I was dead." They reached the center of the ballroom, the very heart of the hive. Seraphina looked out over the sea of pale, frightened faces, her gaze searching for a specific shade of green, the coat Julian Whitmore always wore when he wanted to look like a gentleman. She saw him in the corner, his wine glass trembling in his hand, his face the color of curdled milk. He had expected a tomb, he had found a throne. Seraphina smiled, a slow, predatory curve of the lips that didn't reach her eyes. The beauty and the rot were no longer a tragedy to be pitied, they were the apex predators of the North, and the hunt had officially begun. Julian Whitmore moved through the crowded ballroom with the practiced ease of a man who believed he was walking toward his own coronation. He had spent his final guineas on a waistcoat of emerald silk, a desperate shimmer intended to mask the fact that his pockets were empty and his reputation was in tatters. In his mind, the invitation had been a surrender. He imagined Seraphina, weary of the Duke's decaying presence, beckoning her true love back to claim the wealth that should have been his. He expected to find a widow in all but name. He expected to find a dying master and a desperate girl. As he reached the doors of the private dining hall, Julian straightened his cuffs, a smirk of triumph playing on his lips. He pushed the doors open, ready to offer a rehearsed word of condolence to the shadows. The room was not a tomb, it was an interrogation. The long mahogany table was lit by a phalanx of silver candelabras, their flames steady and unforgiving. At the head of the table sat Seraphina. She did not rise. She sat in the Duke's high-backed chair, her midnight velvet skirts spilling over the floor like an ink blot. To her right sat Lucian, his silvered, scarred face motionless, his eyes tracking Julian's entry with the terrifying patience of a gargoyle. "Julian," Seraphina said, her voice dropping into the silence like a coin into a deep well. "You are late, but then you always were tardy when the bill came due." Julian's smirk faltered. He looked at the Duke, expecting to see a man on the brink of collapse, but Lucian's presence was a physical weight in the room, suffocating and vast. Julian turned back to Seraphina, trying to find the girl he had traded in the chapel. She was gone. In her place was a woman whose gaze felt like a sharpened razor. "Seraphina, my dear," Julian stammered, stepping toward the table. "The invitation, I thought. You must be suffering in this gloom. I've come to discuss the future of the estate, surely. Given the Duke's unfortunate condition." "My condition has improved, Whitmore," Lucian's voice rumbled, a sound like grinding stone, "though I cannot say the same for your credit." Seraphina reached out and tapped a thick stack of vellum documents resting beside her plate. Each page was stamped with a familiar red seal. Julian's heart gave a sickening lurch. He recognized the handwriting of his primary London solicitor, the one who held the mortgages on his family's lands. "I've spent the last month shopping, Julian," Seraphina said softly, her fingers tracing the heavy iron signet on her hand. "But I didn't care for jewelry or gowns. I preferred your gambling markers, your debts to the crown, the mortgage on Whitmore Park. I even bought the note for the very coat you're wearing." Julian's breath hitched. He reached for the back of a chair to steady himself. You couldn't. That's hundreds of thousands." "It is a king's ransom," Seraphina interrupted, her eyes flashing with a cold, crystalline blue. "A ransom paid by the Duke's treasury. You see, when you sold me, you gave me the keys to the vault. You expected to inherit this house from a dead man, but you forgot that I am very much alive." She leaned forward into the candlelight, the ruby on her finger glowing like a fresh wound. "You aren't here as a guest, Julian, and you aren't here as an heir. You are here because your primary creditor has called in your debts, and I am she." The silence in the dining hall was so thick it felt as though the stone walls were closing in, squeezing the air from Julian's lungs. He looked at the stack of debts on the table, then at the woman who held them, and finally understood that the trap had been snapping shut for months. "Seraphina, please," Julian gasped, his voice cracking, the emerald silk of his waistcoat suddenly looking like the skin of a dying snake. "We were to be married. You cannot be so cold. My family's lands, they have been in the Whitmore name for 4 centuries. And you gambled 4 centuries of history for a single bag of gold," Seraphina replied, her voice devoid of heat, flavored only by the bitter iron of justice. "You traded a living soul to settle a ledger. Now I am simply balancing the books." She slid a single, crisp document across the mahogany. It was a deed of transfer, a total surrender of the Whitmore estates to the Duchy of Gravesend. Beside it lay a small, rough object that looked grotesquely out of place atop the fine lace tablecloth, the burlap bag Julian had used to carry away the Duke's gold on the night of the trade. "You have 2 choices, Julian," Seraphina said, the candlelight dancing in the depths of her iron signet ring. "You can sign this deed and walk out of these doors. I will burn your markers, and you will be free of the creditors who are currently waiting for you at the gates. You will have your life, though you will have nothing else." Julian's eyes darted to the doors, imagining the bailiffs and the dark, damp corners of a debtor's prison. "And the second choice?" Lucian leaned forward, his silvered, scarred face coming into the light. "The second choice involves the law, the theft of a noblewoman's agency, and a cellar that has not been opened since the reign of a much crueler king. I find I am in a mood to rediscover my ancestors' methods for dealing with those who swindle the crown." Julian's knees hit the floor. The sound was dull and final. With trembling fingers, he reached for the quill. He signed the deed, the ink bleeding into the parchment like the last of his blood. As the final stroke was completed, Seraphina picked up the burlap bag and tossed it at his feet. It was empty, save for a few grains of dust and the lingering scent of copper. "Go," she commanded. "Take the bag. It was the price you set for me. It is the only thing you own in this world." Julian scrambled for the bag, clutching the rough fabric to his chest as he fled the room, his boots echoing in a frantic, stumbling rhythm down the hall. He vanished into the night, a man without a name, without a home, and without a future. Seraphina stood and walked to the window, watching the distant flicker of his carriage lamps disappear into the mist. She felt a heavy hand on her shoulder, not the skeletal grip of a monster, but the steady, warm weight of a partner. "It is done," Lucian whispered. Seraphina turned to him, the beauty and the rot finally finding peace in the center of their restored kingdom. She looked down at the iron ring on her finger, then up at the man she had saved, and who, in his own dark way, had saved her. "No," she said, a small, true smile finally touching her lips. "It is just beginning."